Welcome, everyone. Good morning. You have just entered the Center for Planning Excellence's annual Smart Growth Summit first session. I'm Camille Manning-Broom, President and CEO of CPEX, and I'm so glad you've set aside the time to join us in these critical discussions that we have carefully curated for you. For the past 15 years, CPEX has put together the Smart Growth Summit as a place for planners, policymakers, and community leaders to come together and share ideas. Not being able to do this in person for our 15th year was a tremendous disappointment for me and my team. Typically, we would be bringing you all together in our home city of Baton Rouge, sharing food with you, taking care of you, creating networking opportunities, putting on a big reception, and special side events for everyone to enjoy. But while this year's summit looks a little different, our commitment to having these necessary conversations about the future of planning in our cities remains the same. This has been and continues to be an incredibly difficult year, but the vulnerabilities that have been laid bare by the events of 2020 speak to the critical importance of the knowledge, experiences, and innovations we're highlighting in this year's summit. And we're honored that you have chosen to join this conversation about defining the new normal. Through the pandemic, it's been dominating the headlines since March, but climate change and systemic equities have also been threatening our future for decades. Together, the widespread impacts of these threats demonstrate one certainty for these uncertain times: we cannot carry on with business as usual. This year's news cycle has highlighted how much work we have left to do, but the pandemic has also proven that people can change their behavior to benefit the common good, and that cities can quickly adapt to meet changing needs. During the 6 sessions taking place today through November 18th, you will have the opportunity to engage with experts who are leading the conversations around climate change, public health, and racial and economic disparities. Huge planning challenges that will define our era. Each summit session is valuable on its own, but I hope you will join us for all 6 to connect the dots between these profound challenges, and I hope you will participate in each session and help build a robust conversation about how all of us, planners, designers, scientists, advocates, and allied professions, play a role in defining this new normal that works better for everyone. Please don't think for a moment you're here as a spectator. The summit isn't just a conversation, it's a call to action. Every one of us has an important role to play in securing our shared future. That means taking action, and it also means being courageous. Courageous enough to do things differently in places where we've gotten comfortable with the status quo. So thank you for being here, wherever you are. And this year that's characterized by change and unrest, I hope this summit is an opportunity to reflect on new and old challenges and have an inspired, constructive dialogue that moves us all toward a better future. Before we move on to today's session, CPEX would like to thank all of our sponsors, especially our platinum sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana, Power Coalition, and the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and our gold sponsors, American Planning Association Louisiana Chapter, LSU Ag Center, and the Nature Conservancy. Closed captions is provided by AARP Louisiana. And this session is brought to you and sponsored by the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. I'm now going to hand it over to Ashley Shelton, CPEX board member and executive director of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. The Power Coalition does amazing work throughout the state of Louisiana, serving as a catalyst for collaboration between policy advocates and community organizing groups. The coalition works to build power and voice in traditionally disenfranchised communities across Louisiana through education and voter turnout. It empowers residents to advocate for policies that create a more equitable and just Louisiana. Thank you. Please welcome Ashley Shelton.
Hello, good morning. Or yeah, it's still morning. Good morning. First, thank you, Camille, for having me here today. I am a proud board member of the Center for Planning Excellence and have enjoyed my time on the board and certainly working with Camille and her team to solve problems in communities across our state. My name is Ashley Shelton. I'm the Executive Director of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. And as she said, we are a civic engagement table that works across the state to engage communities around both their vote and their voice. We are excited to be here today and have this panel of amazing folks from throughout this country that are doing work that is having an unbelievable impact in the midst of this pandemic. And so I would like to introduce our panel today as we think about how, within this pandemic, how we can be leaders in changing our communities. And so let's give me 1 second. I think I'm having a little technical difficulty. Oh, okay, here we go. All right, I've got it. Sorry about that. And so our session today will dive into, the uncertainty that we found ourselves in, following COVID-19 and its realities, examining how cities are responding to the constellation of challenges presented by COVID-19 and how planning can be a vehicle for innovation and growth. In this session, we'll explore how cities and people have responded to public health crises in the past, what tactical innovations we're seeing in cities today, and what ideas have emerged as no regret wins that will help get us to a better future. And to guide us through this conversation, we have a wonderful group of speakers with us today. All right, and we're going to start with Dr. Catherine Brinkley, who is an associate professor of community and regional development at UC Davis, where her research is focused on understanding the public health and economic development consequences of how agricultural and urban lands interface. She is a city planner with a background in veterinary medicine and virology, so we'll hear her perspective on how pandemics have shaped our urban conditions in the past and how that can inform response and recovery in cities today. We also have joining us today Mike Lydon, who is the co-founder and principal at Street Plans, an urban planning design and research advocacy firm based in Miami and New York City, as well as co-author of Tactical Urbanism. Most recently, Mike co-authored NatCo's Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery and led the creation of the Streets for Voting Guide with the Center for Tech and Civic Life. We'll hear more from him today about how this pandemic is pushing cities to innovate. We also have on our panel today Dr. Destiny Thomas, who is the founder and CEO of Thrivance Group. She is an anthropologist, planner with experience in implementing a dignity-infused community engagement methodology, anti-displacement studies, healing environmental and infrastructural trauma, and bolstering agency in marginalized communities within municipal planning processes. She has been a critical voice in the conversation about community engagement as cities retrofit for COVID-19 realities, and we look forward to hearing from her today as well. A few quick housekeeping items. Today's session has been pre-approved for continuing education for certified floodplain managers and certified planners. Realtors, architects, and landscape architects may self-report credit. Please visit the continuing education tab at our website, summit.cpex.org, for more information. We're reserving the final half hour of this session for questions. Please enter your questions into the chat. Yes, questions for the speakers into the Q&A using the button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we are recording this session, and all registrants will receive an email with a video link after the session. So Catherine, we'll turn to you to kick this conversation off.
Thank you, Ashley. All right. A pandemic, police brutality, civil unrest, economic recession, terrible air quality, lack of affordable housing. Unfortunately, we have been here before, and every single time we produce something better through collective action. Today, I'm going to tell you about 3 pandemics that shaped American cities, ultimately making them better. I'm doing this because we're going to open a conversation about what we could and should do to make our lives better right now and for future generations. So this image that I'm starting with is from 1850s New York, there's a cholera epidemic raging, and police are raiding a slum. To understand how pandemics changed planning in cities, I reviewed about 400 years of plans and land use codes from the 1600s to present, and the 4 most populous US cities: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore. This history shows that while responses did not get everything right, there's a lot to learn and to relearn. Crises have always proved an inflection point to move toward more healthful city designs, and this pandemic shouldn't be different. So I said we've been here before. We've been here before many times. My background is in veterinary medicine, and I have a master's degree in virology, which is the study of viruses. I was initially very interested in just why 3 out of the 5 new human diseases we see every year come from animals. And I realized that the laws that govern that interface between urban areas and wildlife are controlled by land use planning. So I pivoted to the design world and got a PhD in planning, and my research focuses on land use and public health. With that, this timeline is to help you visualize that COVID is one of the worst pandemics this century, and it's still growing. It started with animal populations, just like 75% of the novel diseases we see today. This timeline should remind you that cities got through the bubonic plagues, and it should also make you think that COVID will not be the last pandemic we face. About 8 of the last 10 pandemics have been airborne in nature. That generates its own challenges in creating enough distance between people to break the cycle of transmission. Where Ebola is highly infectious at about 3 feet, COVID spreads further. So how can we reconfigure our cities to watch our 6 feet of distance? If you think 2020 is bad, I'm going to take you to 1666 in London, when the city was ravaged by fire, plague, and war. About 80% of Old City London burned, homelessness rose, and 15% of the population was killed due to the plague. Just like now, cities got a bad rap for being unhealthy, and cities set about making changes. So after the fire, London enacted the 1667 Rebuilding Act, which stated that the outsides of all buildings needed to be made of brick or stone. But the fire also inspired plans for a new city, Philadelphia, which was then a British colony. William Penn designed Philadelphia to be a green country town, which would never be burnt and always wholesome. And he laid out grid streets that would be easy to navigate for fire brigades and included large parks that would be fire breaks and would hopefully help prevent disease. So let's see how that turned out for Philadelphia. As you probably know, Philadelphia was the nation's capital until about 1800, when we moved the capital to Washington, D.C. And what spurred that move was the yellow fever outbreak of 1793. Yellow fever killed about 10% of the city's population, causing horrible internal bleeding. Like today, many people with the means fled the city. That included the political elite, like President Washington. It was up to the leaders who stayed to tend the sick and dying. And some of those leaders included Reverend Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who really led the brigades of essential workers that went door to door to collect the sick and bring them to centralized hospitals. They also went door to door to collect the dead and to bury them. And they organized brigades to clean the cities, cleaning the gutters, which doesn't sound as revolutionary as it was, but it really demonstrated the need and effect of early zoning and public health codes that would keep alleyways clear and fund street cleaning, which was something American cities didn't have yet. This cleanup also likely helped reduce the mosquito populations that spread yellow fever. Not incidentally, Reverend Jones and Richard Allen fought racism and disease at the same time, just as essential workers today must. So Allen and Jones were treated horribly by the sick and the dying, and simultaneously racism was perpetuated in land use planning and embedded in legal codes. One of the 5 squares that I showed you that was laid out in William Penn's plan was known as Congo Square, and this was a central meeting place for Black Philadelphians. This is where the majority of the dead were buried in mass graves. Many urban parks have this history as mass graves. And the square has since been renamed after George Washington and is called Washington Square. Meanwhile, in 1793, Washington was busy coordinating efforts for Congress to pass the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that same year. This is a law that put fugitive slaves and freemen at risk of capture, return to the South, and a life of slavery. It also classified children born to slave mothers as property. So the everyday and codified racism that Allen and Jones faced prompted them to write this pamphlet on the right titled A Refutation, which chronicled their experiences during yellow fever and their fight against racism. This pamphlet ought to be required reading in history classes. It should be as well known as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and that it is not is further testimony to the work we need to do in our education system. We have not done enough to honor the healthcare heroes in past pandemics. We have literally taken central gathering spots and turned them into mass graves, renaming the spot after leaders who undermined efforts to tend the sick city. An urgent, no regrets job that public art and historic preservation could take on right now is to help us remember the heroes and institutions of pandemics past, so that we do not keep forgetting that we've been here before, and we do not keep forgetting who helped us out of it, our essential workers. The next major pandemic to sweep the US was cholera. This is a fecal oral pathogen that's largely spread through contaminated water. Again, the response of cities was to make parks. In New York's case, this is really what prompted the creation of Central Park. We often think of Central Park as the lungs of the city, but really it was the guts that gobbled up all of the city's waste and later slurped up clean water through a very long straw. To make room for Central Park, police were dispatched to a low-income neighborhood full of Irish immigrants, free Blacks, and First Nations people. This neighborhood ran pig feeding operations that collected and processed the city's slops because there weren't municipal garbage services at the time. So this picture shows Superintendent Downing evicting the poor and is captioned "intense discontent," as you can imagine there was. By removing the waste processing and the food supply, the pigs, and the livelihoods of the low income, New York necessitated the creation of food subsistence programs, public housing programs, and sanitation departments. This was all very costly. There was also the cost of the new infrastructure. Central Park would house a giant reservoir, which was designed to deliver fresh, clean water to the growing city. And this reservoir was the endpoint for the nation's first great aqueduct, which sucked up water from the countryside and brought it to Central Park. So public services and infrastructure became large investments for cities, which necessitated rethinking their tax schemes. And cities today should be prepared to take on additional costs, especially if federal and state budgets will not support the efforts. So now we're pivoting into the airborne era. 8 of the last 10 pandemics have been airborne, and they are really tricky to out-engineer. But we're also stuck on a false understanding of disease and density, as this tweet from Governor Cuomo demonstrates. He says there's a density level in New York City that is destructive. And it has to stop, and it has to stop now, as if you could stop New York's density right now. So I want to take this moment to say that major cities are more likely entry points for disease. They provide a lot of human hosts for disease amplification, but history shows that suburbs and rural areas tend to fare worse during airborne pandemics and after them as well. For example, more people died of Spanish flu in Alaska on a per capita basis than anywhere else in the country. And there are similar patterns for COVID. There are many reasons for this. You can go to the next slide, please. Lower density areas suffer more because they have fewer, smaller, less well-equipped hospitals, and because rural areas are not as economically resilient as large cities. So economic recovery takes longer after a pandemic has caused mass unemployment. In a country that doesn't have universal health care, there's a strong tie between health and those who can afford health care. So you can see these COVID numbers on the graph here showing that initially many COVID cases were in large cities, but now we're seeing more COVID cases in small and medium-sized cities as a growing trend. So if history is any lesson, cities will rebound faster and disease may linger in the suburbs and rural areas. Next slide, please. So some things have stayed the same. There's been a disproportionate impact on low-income immigrants and communities of color. The CDC, for example, shows that there are 5 times higher hospitalization rates for non-whites. Planning and public health has sought to innovate its way out of every pandemic. Often there's a knee-jerk response for more green space. With this pandemic, the rationale has changed a little bit because we no longer think that it's an unhealthy miasma that's causing disease. Now the rationale for green space is that it helps improve mental health and we all need to get outside. And perhaps this is a good thing. There's also a big response at the local and city level through zoning and building codes to change how we do things, which that ground up stance means that we really need to think about proof of concept and see what works and why. And there have been increasing public services, especially around food, housing, water, and waste. So many cities, for example, are innovating with anti-eviction legislation. This inflection point, however, is a little bit different. Thanks to advocates like Jane Jacobs, planning now has a democratic process that emphasizes transparency. So William Penn can't just draft a plan without community input, and often many, many years of community input. Also, equity is a focus, albeit a very new one. The goal of environmental justice is to correct the injustice that was created by conscious design or institutional neglect, as Dr. Robert Bullard, one of the founders of environmental justice, has said. In California, for example, plans are now mandated to address environmental justice since last year with Senate Bill 1000. This really considers the cost burden of greenhouse gas emission reduction, as well as where funding is allocated and which neighborhoods benefit. So the goal is that neighborhoods will still get amenities like Central Park, but no longer will the low-income communities be evicted to make those parks. And this is important because when Central Park was created, it wiped out a Black middle class in our nation's financial capital, which one has to think changed the trajectory of our country. So now another thing that's different is that we live in a data-rich online world where we have access to city plans and we can use machine learning. So you don't have to sit in the archives for several years like I did and comb through plans. Now you can rapidly access many plans all at once. And this is important because plans are often over 400 pages long, and they gather many innovative ideas that are very different from each location. So now it's far easier for researchers like me to read and compare plans with their outcomes. It's easier for communities to rapidly read and borrow from plans, so that way they can keep up with the Joneses and see what's happening next door in other cities and copy it. And it's also easier for states to track innovation at the local level and then support it. So now I'm going to pivot from that archival research to show you some new research which is informed by my historic work. You can imagine that going through the library and pulling up old plans was difficult, and I was very eager to have all the plans in one area and rapidly read them. So this is what we've tried to do. We've assembled a database of all city and county comprehensive plans for California, and we've used machine learning to read them. Some things I want to point out about the corpus of California plans is that about 20% of the county and city comprehensive plans were adopted more than 20 years ago. So they are out of date and out of touch. Many cities and counties lack the funding to update their plans. The budget crisis is only going to make that worse during the pandemic. And time is running out. Plans are needed to address this crisis right now. So my hope is that the tools we're developing can make good planning quicker, cheaper, and more effective. So to help, my research team created this online searchable database of city and county plans. It's only California at this point, but we're eager to grow the effort. And you can search any topic. If there's anything that a city holds dear, that a city thinks is precious, it will put it in its plan. So for example, if you care about historic preservation of Chinatowns, there are many wonderful plans that talk about this. Or perhaps you care about LGBTQ landmark sites. West Hollywood has an excellent piece in their general plan on that. Or maybe you care about micro-transportation solutions. The example that I'm giving you now is environmental justice, which is a new requirement. So suppose you live in a city that needs to update its plan, needs to incorporate environmental justice, and you wonder, gosh, how did other cities do this? Now you can search across over 400 city plans, 58 county plans to find out how they did this. So, and then the search results will show you the hits per county and per city, how many hits, and you can sort based on city size. So our research has demonstrated that there are many cities that are leading the charge and incorporating environmental justice through their focus on health. And they do this in a variety of different ways, from focusing on food deserts to focusing on citing energy. And there's a lot we're learning and plan to continue learning with a deeper comparison. So with that, I want to end on this slide because this is a place that I take students every year when I teach a study abroad course where we tour Europe's sustainable planning features firsthand for inspiration. We have a long way to go before American planning reaches feats like this. This is a waste to energy plant in the heart of Copenhagen, which is an amenity. It burns municipal solid waste, makes heat and energy. It has a ski slope on top and a cafe and a climbing wall, and it's surrounded by pretty nice apartment buildings. It doesn't smell. We have a long way to go before we reduce per capita emissions by 60% from their peak, like the Swedes have. And the way we do it is probably going to look very different because the local context is different and our planning process is different. So it's important to see what has worked in the past. It's also important to see what is working locally so that we keep up with the Joneses, not necessarily the Johannessons. Our planning tool can help locate innovations in American planning and track them to successful outcomes. And we hope that that will help propagate what works. So now I'm going to turn to my co-panelists for more information on what we can do right now with tactical urbanism and the deep community work that is needed to realize equity in the planning process in a country that has had to fight racist land policies and pandemics simultaneously for far too long.
Great. Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful overview of history and where we have been collectively with cities over the last several centuries. It's really informative, obviously, for what we're all trying to manage and deal with today. So yes, let us now pivot to streets, which is what we focus a lot of our time, energy, and passion doing at Street Plans. And I will speak to some of these quick responses that cities have created over the last 6 or 7 months. So next slide, please. But like Catherine, I think it's important to go back in history at least a little ways and think about where some of the momentum or some of the tools, some of the approaches have roots that we're managing and dealing with and applying today. And so I want to speak just briefly about Bogota, Colombia. And as some of you might know, their weekly ciclovia is when they remove cars from more than 75 miles of streets every Sunday. And those miles of streets connect to every single neighborhood or the majority of neighborhoods throughout the entire city in the network. So everybody has access to open space and to recreation and to social connection. And this movement, which is now globally renowned, has its roots in environmental justice and activism in the 1970s. And so it was a small group of people who set out to change its increasingly auto-dominated political realities in the city to win back the streets for people and for green transportation and for connecting as so many people have in cities for centuries before. Next slide. Learning of that work, well over a decade ago was super inspiring for what I was doing, which is, like, as Catherine explained, big planning, comprehensive plans, zoning codes, master plans, and realizing that while those documents are really important to set forth policies, vision, give direction, hopefully inspiration, most people in most cities don't read those plans. They're not aware of them. They're not part of the plan creation process. And they certainly are not going to stand up and advocate for them if they aren't aware of their existence. So while they're important at the high policy and government level and for advocates, for everyday citizens, we oftentimes miss the boat as planners. So for me, what was really inspiring was Bike Miami Days in 2008, go back really quick, and helping to co-organize that with a team of people in Miami when I used to live there. And realizing that for all the plans and things that I was working on, it was really this really quick, very inexpensive, very inclusive event that shut down a few miles of streets in the city's core that could bring people together and have them rethink and experience, I mean, what if our streets were more friendly all the time, or at least with frequency, so that we could reuse them in different ways. Next slide. So that was one of the real inspirations for, for tactical urbanism, and how can we use these, short-term projects and engagements as a way to connect with people, to do outreach and engagement, and to learn the kinds of things that people want to see in the mid and long term in their communities, and let that be a platform for that. It certainly had that role for me in developing the city's first bike master plan. It was really kind of keyed into using the open streets as a way to engage with a far wider and richer group of people to talk about where else they wanted to see safer streets around the entire city. Next slide. So really what we've done is looked at how long-term planning and capital projects get built, and we've kind of worked backwards into various increments and developed different tools for engagement, materials, evaluation, that allows us to deliver projects incrementally over time. And each one of them allows for a different form of process in that delivery. And while you may not always go from a really short-term, 1 day or 1 week, demonstration project to a pilot to an interim design to long-term capital, certainly one can jump from one approach to another. These are tools that are available in the process of planning, both for engagement and for testing ideas, at least as it relates to streets, public spaces, and oftentimes empty or underutilized land or buildings. Next slide. So with that in mind, we've tried to build a movement around open streets, which were primarily, starting more than a decade ago in the United States, adapting what we learned about in South America and other inspiring places across the globe, and focusing on physical activity and trying to bring opportunities for physical activity where open space is limited and where people are in need of it. There's sort of a secondary focus on building community and social connections, and then maybe a tertiary focus on economic activities. Certainly some businesses do quite well when open streets are connected to their main streets or neighborhood nodes. Next. But of course, in March 2020, everything changed. So I was just thinking, enjoying this call, we were last together with CPEX at the summit about 11 months ago, and we couldn't be as far away from that reality as we are today, it feels. So I'm from New England, so maybe those in Louisiana have a certain type of accent. Those of us from New England have our own accent, and so this was really a fun sign that I noticed the other day while in Maine. And so this is the kind of the new reality of getting that 6 feet, having that distance, creating space for each other and for ourselves, and that's certainly a challenge for those of us who live in New York City or other dense cities to accomplish that. Next. So when the realities of this started to hit cities and planners and activists quickly, we realized that where are we going to find space? Where are we going to be able to move people, meaning essential workers? We're going to be able to get emergency vehicles around our streets. How are we going to give people spaces to recreate when all of a sudden the daily footprint was shrinking from miles to maybe just a few blocks? And it really became the streets. Streets make up about 1/3 of all land in cities, and therefore have a critical role to play in delivering services, creating safety, and of course, providing recreation and open space for communities. And so at that time, in mid-March, I started to document how cities were responding to the pandemic on a global scale, and started keeping track of a open source spreadsheet that allowed people to share information from around the globe on what their cities were doing in response, and then basically organized those responses into a typology, which is what you see here. Now, there's been a few different variants off of this, of course, but really there was an adaptation of open streets at large. This idea that we would not have full 100% car access on streets, and that we would create open spaces using that street space for a variety of different purposes. And the iterations you see therein with the 6 different options on how streets have been used in various ways. Next slide. Many other people have started to contribute and in fact have taken over that database and expanded upon it gratefully, because I did not have the time to personally maintain it. So now there's a collection from Numo and Mobility Works, those of us at Street Plans, PBIC, which is based in North Carolina, have all been building this single now document that you can access, which has more than 400 cities, 40+ countries, those 6 core tactics, and now others, including policies. and more than 1,250 total actions that have been taken on a global scale. Now, so many of these changes, of course, were not envisioned even just 6 or 7 months ago. And so the speed of adaptation has been pretty remarkable at a global scale. And I'd say you see a lot of this happening in Europe, North America, other cities in South America, and then Australia and New Zealand. A little bit less of it, although increasingly so in the Asian and African context. Next slide. Quickly, we've seen just whole, networks of streets be transformed, or at least promises to transform those networks. There's been a lot of debate and conversation about, should we be doing this during a pandemic? How do we do this during a pandemic? What is fair and just, and what does that engagement start to look like? And I know that Destiny will get into those issues probably in some more detail. But regardless, the scale of the effort has been from Paris at more than 400 miles, down to just Brussels there, just under 70 miles, has been at a scale that we couldn't even imagine previously. And I just want to call out Oakland, California, as being a really interesting case study, as really the first US city to start thinking about pandemic response at scale with networks. Now, they've had their own ups and downs and successes and challenges and issues with their Slow Streets program, but they certainly did kick off and inspire many other cities around the United States to think about their responses to streets and transportation at a network level, including here in New York City, where I live and advocate. Next slide. So soon thereafter, these concerns about equity, where these projects were being installed, how the communication was happening, and what types of adaptations were taking place, became quite clear that this had to be thought through more coherently and holistically. And I think Providence was one of the first cities that I saw release a Slow Streets program that looked at the data, looked at where people had the least access to open street, had to open space, were living in the highest densities, and really could benefit primarily from additional space using streets. And here you can see that the number of streets and corridors they put into service to accomplish that. And that was about 13 different miles of streets around the various neighborhoods. So it really did touch upon most places across the city. You could get access to a place to get outside and to walk, to see neighbors at distance. And if you're an essential worker, perhaps travel to and get on the bus or take a car out to where you needed to go. Next slide. And this idea of adaptation has evolved as each compounding social, political, environmental crisis has been thrust upon us during this pandemic. And so what's been interesting is the streets have been utilized in all sorts of different ways to communicate these messages, to gather, and ideally gathering safely, and to create places for people to grieve and to protest and to connect. And in that, there's been a lot of inherent, contradictions, which are worth mentioning, at least a couple of them. Next slide. So seeing what was emerging and kind of transitioning from the lessons learned in the database, we were able to partner with NACDO and the Global Designing Cities Initiative to put together a whole range of policies that could be put into play in response to the pandemic, both for the most immediate response. So what do you do right now as you go into lockdown, into crisis, but then what do you do as you start to slowly reopen and hopefully continue to reopen and move towards a recovery? And what does our transportation system look like in the future, and how this can be a step change towards achieving some of those goals? Next. So there's a whole range of different ways that we've described and provide guidance with NACDO on streets, everything from service delivery to open and play streets, to bike lanes, to gathering and events. Like, how do you use streets for, let's say, for funerals? How do you use it for graduations? How do we create some semblance of normal and ritual in our communities by turning towards our streets? Next slide. So there's a whole menu of these 2-page cut sheets that walk you through the basics if you're interested in learning more and how to apply some of these changes and the materiality and the design considerations and the outreach and engagement techniques that can be considered as part of that process. Next. Streets for Protest is one of these issues that, as we started to write this guide, became extremely central and important to the work, and trying to provide a platform of information for communities to think about, holistically and thoughtfully on how to you can't really plan for protests, but how do you respond and support and make those places safe? Of course, the biggest challenge there is some of the clashes that do occur during protests between between government and citizens, and seeing that play out has been obviously challenging, but there are practices that should be considered to make sure that us as human beings are safe in our streets as protests are organized and are carried out. Next. And finally, outdoor dining is a sample. You can go to the next slide. This has been such a critical lifeline for us here in New York City. Next. I call it New York City's Unintentional Parking Reform Program. Really we turned in June towards the streets for dining after many months of communities advocating and restaurant owners advocating for this. It's been such a big, bold experiment, as Mayor de Blasio said. We've got more than 10,000 restaurants that are operating on sidewalks, in parking spaces, and in streets themselves. The estimates are that more than 100,000 jobs have been saved based on this program, which is huge when you think about the types of people who do work in restaurants and the range of neighborhoods that covers and impacts. Having those jobs preserved during this pandemic has been obviously really critical at a time when our unemployment rate in New York City right now is about 16%, which I think is about double the national average. But when you get down to it, the parking, street design, access, reform, a policy approach to this, what you look at the numbers and you find that per parking space, if used for dining, the government revenue that can be generated with dining versus parking is 488% greater. Now we can get into the assumptions and how that breaks down maybe in the conversation with questions, but the fact being that each parking space yields far less revenue than using it for dining in terms of tax receipts. Next. So we've seen the good of this response, certainly with the dining, cafe, even retailing in public spaces and in our streets and the adaptations that have happened. Next. We've seen the awful, right? I think this trend of people using their cars as weapons, particularly during protests when the opposite side has agitated, and then cars become a means as a weapon to inflict injury, if not death, on other people who are in the public realm, is becoming extremely concerning. And this is maybe the most American of responses to protests, is to see the use of cars brandished as weapons. It's kind of a uniquely American challenge that I've been seeing across the globe as it relates to the protests. Next. And then the confusing, right? These images were, this image in particular was so impactful for so many people in different ways around the nation. This is Cincinnati, where you see a number of white, young, perhaps well-heeled brunchers out enjoying a cafe experience during the middle of this pandemic, while other people are out marching for Black Lives Matters and having their civic voice heard and marching for justice. And so that contrast was just so sharp, I think, for so many people. And a lot of people, I think, rightfully are very critical of this scene, right? But there's so many different factors and issues that play out on our streets that they're, having both of these happen simultaneously was basically bound to happen. And that a lot of the streets that have been used for open streets for movement, et cetera, have actually then been used for protest bike rides and protests and sit-ins and all sorts of other civic gatherings that are using them for that purpose. And so, it's very complex, the use of these streets and why and how they're being used. And it's really worth engaging in that conversation deeper to understand how this can be played out, so that everyone has access to the streets for a variety of different purposes, whether it be economic, civic, social, or for health or transportation. Next. I'm just going to briefly talk about a project where we've seen those complexities play out. We've been involved in Northampton, Massachusetts for the last 9 months or so, working on an actual long-term redesign of their main street. We've been working with an engineering firm called Tool Design Group, and we were a subconsultant to kind of manage some of the public engagement and to run a large-scale demonstration of how this street might be redesigned for the long term, since there's a state grant to do so in 2025. So this is really a long-term, kind of deep and long engagement project to result in this once-in-a-generation reconstruction of all the infrastructure on the streets. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we were unsure if we were going to be doing any sort of demonstration whatsoever of the possibilities or options on the street itself. Then the cases started to recede in Massachusetts, and very quickly we pivoted with a state grant to scale up that work to be a very large-scale installation that was building off of what the city did on one half of the main street, which is what you see here. Next slide. And we decided that was a big success for restaurants, and people seem to really adapt and like that change to the street. And so the second phase of that work was to take this upper part of Main Street, which looks like this with City Hall there in the background, and next slide, convert it to this kind of space where, yes, you could still drive, but you have access for outdoor dining, retailing, more physical distancing, and cycling, scooting, skating, etc. Next slide. The merchants on the street cried bloody murder with this project, and were collectively able to organize themselves into convincing the mayor to then remove it. So I'd throw this into the category of a failure, but with lots of lessons learned, which we can get to in the Q&A, but seeing how even the differences in the expectations and the needs of people just within a few blocks of each other in a community like Northampton could be so different, and the response could be so different to this approach was really interesting, and created a lot of interesting insights for us for the long-term redesign, and are helping us go back to the engagement drawing board to think about how we talk about this project and design the street moving forward. Next. Next slide, please. So I'm going to close here. If we think about streets and our civic duties, like where do these things overlap, and what can we at street plans or as advocates for better cities, and of course for democracy and inclusion, is to think about how streets can be used during the pandemic for voting. And so we're partnered with the Center for Tech and Civic Life, using a grant to develop very quickly in the last 6 weeks a new guide for voting. Next slide. We know that people are going to be required to be either outdoors or distancing, which means queues will be longer. We know that people will be voting by car. We know that people will be forced to travel long distances, endure heat, rain, snow, etc. on election day are all possibilities. And so turning to our streets to be a place to do this safely and effectively is probably a critical step in a lot of communities around the country, particularly those that have seen their voting centers either removed and consolidated, or those where other challenges like standing in line is very tough for someone who might be physically disabled for hours at a time. So how do you retrofit voting to happen so that people have safe access and can exercise their civic right and not suppress voting on the day of the election or even before leading up to it. So we developed this in their cut sheet with NACDA that just got released late last week. Next slide. So that was kind of step one, getting city transportation officials to understand this work, and then pivoting to urban locations and how we adapt them for voting. Next slide. To suburban, thinking about school sites and how we adapt schools and parking lots and drive accesses for this activity, how that is done safely without precluding those who don't have a car, how they can get to sites like this, and how we engender safe transportation access with other means and modes. Next slide. And then we'll be detailing the rural as well. And then getting into the nitty-gritty details of the materials and the health and comfort for people, and how we organize the streets to allow for voting at this time during a pandemic. Next. And so there will be material guidance and where you can access all these materials and things as well. So if your community is interested in this, certainly get in touch. It'll be fully released next week. And we are taking applications, which is a one-page application in the guide for us to work with communities, particularly those that are minority majority or are going to experience the potential for voter suppression. We will work with you and provide technical assistance on how to adapt streets for this purpose. Next. So I'm going to end here. This moment, is not about street design per se. I 100% recognize that. But streets are where COVID is most visibly playing out in our lives at this moment. And what can we all learn from each other and from this is going to be really critical in how we pivot our cities, to Catherine's earlier points, and think about the future and how we can all live in our cities and communities better and from here on out, and what these next innovations are pretty critical. Next and final slide. The biggest barrier to all this is us, right? I mean, reducing the barriers is not a technical challenge necessarily. It's not a social challenge. It's really just a human challenge on how we can get out of our own way and work better together in our streets, in our communities, to foster what our neighborhoods become in the future. And so that's what we're focused on now, and look forward to some of your questions moving forward. So thank you very much.
So my name is Dr. Destiny Thomas, and before I jump into things, I just want to say thank you to CPEX for having me and for creating a venue for me to share my perspective on this very important issue to me. I'm going to spend my time talking about our idea for strategies for reparative urbanism. This is work that we're doing at the Thrivance group. We'll be doing it, in a more rooted way in 2021. We'll be releasing an action plan that goes into details about not just policies that we believe our planning sector should implement, but built interventions as well. But before I get into this, I just want to lift up, first of all, thank you, Dr. Brinkley, for that very thorough overview and historical grounding that gave us a solid picture, a good illustration of the legacy of mistreatment of people who have been intentionally marginalized or oppressed over generations. I myself come from a neighborhood and a community and a state where literally being outside up until very recently, the early 2000s, could be deemed a criminal act if you are outside with more than 3 people at a time and you are all of the same race. Our field has come a long way in terms of its ability to adapt and to be innovative, but what we have not distanced or strayed away from is our contribution to the legacy of slavery and racism in the United States. One thing I'm going to focus on today, because that's a big topic, is our field's failure to really address the intra-community needs that existed before COVID-19, but are definitely worsened as a result of COVID-19. And so I want folks, as I go through my slides, to think about what it would feel like, because I know many people don't come from neighborhoods where just being outside is a criminal act. So think about, as I go through these slides, how difficult a choice it could be for some folks to simply enjoy being outside. And then also think about, as we innovate and implement these concepts like slow streets and open streets, at what point are we going to stop and evaluate the scale of impact, both positive outcomes and negative outcomes? Because I do think we're borrowing a lot from the past, right? We are looking at processes and design interventions that we already have and that we're used to, and finding a way to do them quicker and cheaper. And so this presentation is really about how we break that dynamic up and start to lean into new ways of doing the work. Oh, next slide. So I think one of the biggest threats to intra-community connectivity is that, especially in transit planning, but also in pedestrian network planning and bicycle network planning, we tend to center the commuter dynamic, right? So we plan for people who are traveling long distances to get from home to a job, or to hurry up and pass through a so-called undesirable community. And this has been how we have done planning for centuries. And the impact of this is that there are certain communities who are adjacent our priority corridors and the streets that we focused all of our innovative resources on. There are communities that literally can't connect within their own community because of the emphasis that we've placed on transporting choice users and more desirable citizens to pass through and pass over communities that our government and institutions see less value in. And so one of the things we always do at the Thrivance group is do an impact analysis. And so I want to talk about what that process is like for us. Next slide. So in the context of reparations, which is something that we're championing, we're wanting to consider the scale of impact of our past behaviors as a field. And right now, during COVID-19, we're looking at these three impacts because these are the 3 that have been exacerbated by economic downturn, civil unrest, and environmental injustices. So next slide. The first thing I want to talk about is, this practice of piloting, right? Where we essentially are saying, build it, don't ask permission. It's better to apologize later than to ask now. And that's really how pilot programs and urban or tactical urbanism look to many communities and people who haven't been engaged by processes, either through that process or processes in the past. And so I think that these place-based harms are really solid ways to measure the extent to which the legacy of racism and slavery still show up in our work. And to that end, I think the fact that these are place-based harms, right, means that we can track these impacts across time, because we're tracking them on things that are against things that are literally built, right, and stationary in many ways. So place-based harm during COVID-19 has shown up in these three key ways. The first one is that we've seen an influx of, police brutality, police violence, Black people dying at the hands of police. I have a picture of Dijon Kizzy's mother here at a vigil. And Dijon Kizzy, for those of you who don't know, was killed a month ago while riding his bike in South Central LA. And the initial police report about his death stated that he was in violation of bicycle code. And so regardless of what the media has done and what police have done since then to try to explain the situation away, it can't be lost on us that at some point, the fact that this person was highly visible by way of riding a bike in a community that is historically criminalized being outside, he is gone, right? And the justification for his death was misuse of a bicycle. Ahmaud Arbery was an incident that really landed on me in a very heavy way. He was doing something that I actually love doing. I live in LA again. And before COVID-19, I would actually drive to Beverly Hills and literally run up and down the hills and stop and look at the pre-construction and the houses that were in the middle of construction. I would poke my head in, and I just love to see the inside of the walls before they go up. And so when I saw both the execution of Ahmaud Arbery while he was jogging down the middle of the road and hunted down by two vigilantes, and then subsequently the video, what they think is a video of him doing what I love to do, which is check on new construction and learn things. I think he was an aspiring developer. It really stuck to me, and this happened right around the same time where there were calls for slow streets and open streets and play streets programs. And I remember being very vocal about how dangerous it could be. Number one, it's unfair to people who know that they just can't go outside and be very visibly Black during a time of duress. But it's even more dangerous for those among us who haven't been taught that yet, or who haven't had experienced the extreme trauma that teaches you that when you're outside, you are under hyper surveillance and subject to vigilantism. I don't believe Ahmaud was aware of that, but that is not his fault, because you should be able to jog down the street without being gunned down. And then in the picture to the far right, there's a photo of literally protesters being corralled into a street so that the President of the United States could gas them. And I just wanted to bring these three examples up as we have these conversations about what we do during and post-COVID. We can't do any of that unless we resolve the legacy of racism as it is showing up today, the legacy of slavery as it is showing up today. 30% of fatal police shootings happen in the largest cities in the United States, and the most dense cities, and the cities where they're implementing concepts like open streets and slow streets. And I'm not making a reductive connection between open streets and Black people being killed by police, but there is some causality. There's a speculation that these types of projects lead to, right? This was what happened in the case of Breonna Taylor. There's still an investigation going on about whether or not her no-knock raid was a mechanism, a scare tactic, or an intimidation tactic being used in order to speed up the process of gentrification in her neighborhood. And so when we say that a community is ripe for change or perfect for transformation, or believe that we can just change the landscape of it overnight without community buy-in, what we do is we invite these kind of players into the conversation to hyper enforce that intention. It's also, one of the things I wanted to mention on this was that, you know, people are hearing me use the word vigilantism, and I know some people think that this is a rarity, but it is not. This June, actually June 26th, right after Breonna Taylor's murder, the FBI released a statement urging and encouraging people to have a heightened sense of vigilantism in response to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So another thing that we include in our impact analysis is a deeply rooted understanding about where disproportionality is showing up. And so these are just some context that I grabbed from the internet real quick. But what we all know is that COVID-19 is disproportionately killing and impacting the lives of Black people, First Nations people, as well as Latinx community members. And so, and then also a lot of us in California are still experiencing the impact of raging fires and reduced air quality. And I just want to state that most Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the United States grow up and live a lifetime in communities where the air quality is just as bad as the air quality that you are temporarily experiencing as a result of these fires. And so when we think about the disproportionality in the deaths of people who have COVID, as well as the negative impacts of the fires and other environmental emergencies and crises that we're experiencing today, we also have to think about the fact that Black and Brown communities are home to our bus depots, are home to all of the manufacturing plants that make all of your green technology. And so even our efforts to respond to the so-called climate crisis are rooted in this construct of environmental racism. We're doing it at the expense of Black bodies and without their input. And then lastly, this is a 5-year snapshot on the very right-hand side of the disproportionality when it comes to fatal police shootings in this country. So these disproportionalities, aside from COVID-19, existed before COVID-19. And what COVID-19 is telling us is that if we could plot all of these disparities on top of each other, it is not COVID-19, right, that is killing Black, Brown, and Latinx people. I mean, Black, Latinx, and First Nations people. It is not COVID-19. We talk about COVID-19 like COVID-19 is a person that has decided who it will kill. That is not the case. COVID-19 is showing up within a system of structures and institutions that sanction the disproportionate negative impacts showing up again on Black and Brown bodies. Next slide, please. And then lastly, one of the, in our impact analysis, one of the things that's coming up for us during COVID-19 is the worsening of threats to civil rights. And so we saw, you know, people who are unhoused, living in encampments, experiencing not just sweeps, but criminalization, police brutality. Those activities were requested and sanctioned by local municipalities and elected officials. We see a threat happening to the literal frameworks that have been built to pull us out of the legacy of slavery, like critical race theory. We see that there is an attack on the Black vote in this country, and we all know why. But as you know, it was interesting to see the recommendations for streets during pandemic for voting, because I still wonder if there is consideration being lent to, again, what it will feel like in a state of crisis, in a state of unrest, where white people are literally hunting Black people down. What it will mean to have to stand outside for 3 hours, no matter what the accommodations and amenities are, to expose your body to that type of threat, especially under the President of the United States, who has already called for white supremacists and vigilantes to go out and patrol the areas that we will be voting in. And then also, it goes without mentioning that even where we have already been unduly brutal and unfair to our First Nations communities, we are doubling back and doubling down. We, this country, are doubling down on causing even more harm and trauma in the communities. Next slide, please. So I want to end by talking about a semi-long list. Oh, actually, I want to talk about the complexities of the approaches that we've been taking during COVID-19. Next slide, please. So I will breeze through these in the interest of time, but we do have some, response models that are pretty common across the United States. Next slide, please. And I think that open streets, play streets, ciclovia, they're all very inspiring, inspirational models, right? And ideals that we should strive toward. But I want to lift up that when we implement these types of changes without community buy-in and without partnership from the safety net that is already struggling to meet the needs of communities who we have forgotten about or intentionally left behind, we add an element, a physical element of hostility to them doing that work and to them meeting those needs. And so these pictures are examples of how that shows up during a time where we have urged people to rest, to take shelter. We're implementing infrastructure like the two photographs on the left hand side of the screen to keep people from resting, right? And then also denying them means to dignified housing and shelter. The one in the middle is very striking to me because it illustrates the culture clash that is happening between folks who are, I believe, well-meaning and wanting to do what they can to save the so-called environment without considering, though, the people who live in that environment. And so I just thought that the irony of seeing greening elements used to keep unhoused people from seeking shelter really spoke to the state of crisis that our field is currently in. And then the last picture, where we see this alfresco dining experience, what we don't see is accessibility for people using assistive devices. What we don't see is the addition of a curb ramp or even a temporary one so that folks can access this restaurant and enjoy the access and enjoy the alfresco dining too. And so when we have interventions like this, again, we're signaling who we're interested in serving, protecting, and planning for, and who we would like to stay out of that conversation. Next slide. And then lastly, I think one of the tactics we're using right now is to redefine what it means to be connected. And so, yes, I was one of the more vocal residents and community members who pushed back on the introduction of slow streets in Oakland. That is because I'm familiar with Oakland's infrastructural crisis. These are communities, many of them that were initially planned for street closures, were communities where there is no drainage, period. And the pavement itself, the pavement and the sidewalks themselves are grossly eroded, and there's no floodplain planning, and the list goes on and on. But these are communities where the water quality is toxic in and of itself, and so it just feels cruel to me to suggest that we simply put up A-frames or prop up temporary vertical elements to give space for bikes and even strollers without considering the long-term health and well-being of communities that have already been suffering. Similarly to the point I made earlier, this picture in the middle represents even now when we have an opportunity to rethink transit as an entire business line, we still have failed to sit down and talk about what it would look like to repurpose and redirect transit-related resources to intra-community connectivity. We're still looking for ways to cover the greatest amount of geographic region and to still generate the most revenue, right? And we think that scattering bus stops across the whole city equals connectivity, and it doesn't. And then lastly, our micromobility tech industry still has not been required by most places to develop service provision rollout models that actually meet the first and last mile needs of the communities who are disproportionately impacted by our crises. Next slide. Lastly, the tech divide is really showing its ugly head. Over-reliance on Zoom for meetings that would typically require years of community engagement. We're giving folks one opportunity to access the internet and leave a comment that may or may not go on the record. Next slide. So I want to very quickly get us to a discussion about how we heal and how we atone and how we get to reparations in the built environment. I'm aware of the time, so this will be super quick, but I hope we can cover this in the Q&A session. Next slide. So we take a harm reductive approach to intervention. So one of the things that's coming up for us during COVID-19 is increased vulnerability of people who are subject to human trafficking and gender-based violence. So what kind of interventions can happen in the built environment to prevent this from happening, right? Things like lighting, actually things that don't isolate you, things that encourage a level of connectivity that doesn't require you to have to travel long distances to get to quality of life destinations and services. Next slide. Small business economic development, very straightforward to some, but what I want to put emphasis on here is that we have underground economies and informal economies that keep us thriving when our cities forget to think about us. And so while I think, again, alfresco dining experiences are amazing, I had one last week that I enjoyed, it is also important to me that my local street vendors, the people whose homes I go to sit between their laps to get my hair braided, also have space designated for them to do the business that's been serving us this whole time. Next slide. Mental health advocacy. I do think that the idea that having access to outside is like intrinsically linked to mental well-being, but we also should consider that a large percentage of the number of Black bodies who are killed, especially at the hands of city, county, and transit police, are killed because of ableism that has misread their mental disabilities or mental health crises and criminalize them instead of bringing the pathological and behavioral health support that they need. And so how do we design spaces that are safe for them too? Next slide. Environmental justice was touched on, I think, in a very thorough way. So the only thing I would add is to consider not doing environmental justice work at the expense of people who are already experiencing disproportionate impacts as a result of environmental racism. Next slide. We're promoting in all that we do anti-displacement frameworks. And so it's not enough to just work to keep people in place anymore. At this point, we need to be working to actually bring people back to communities. We did some on-the-ground surveys at the beginning of COVID-19 and saw Black and Brown communities are lined with furniture that's been dumped on the curbs, moving vans that people have packed up but are living in. And so I want us to think about how we welcome folks back to communities during and after COVID-19 with our new planning interests. Food security and access is important, but I think, you know, some of you are probably used to having access to things like farmers market. Those are not as common, and where we do have them in our community, they're scarce, they're rare, and they don't accept the types of forms of payment that we need them to. So how do we begin to build spaces and transform spaces for the purpose of food security? Next slide. Thank you for letting me give my presentation and for all of the wonderful insights that my colleagues have given as well. I look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. This has been a really powerful discussion. Really excited to, really excited to just have heard so many of the comments today. And so I'm going to jump us right into, some discussion. And so one, I want to ask folks to input their questions. And put their questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. I know we've been answering questions as the panelists have been speaking, but certainly you can see the Q&A at the bottom. You know, we've heard from each of you about the significant challenges that planners and cities are facing, along with some successful and not so successful responses to those challenges. And we, also too, we'd like to hear from you guys, in particular, each of our panelists today, what are some of the ideas for no regrets investments that cities can make? And I think Dr. Thomas, as well as Dr. Lydon and Dr. Brinkley have already kind of started to share some of those, but I know after speaking to them in preparation for this panel that they also have, some ideas that I would love for them to share with you around what are those kind of no regret investments that cities can make, and especially as we talk about that from a racial equity and racial justice lens. Who would like to start? Catherine?
Sure, I'll start by echoing what Dr. Thomas said, in that a lot of cities are opening up parking spot and extra space for restaurants, which is great for their brick and mortars, but they're at the same time not opening it up to street food vendors. So we did this study in California. In the state of California, you cannot ban street food vending unless you can regulate it, but only through public health. And we found that about half of the cities in California ban street food vending. So they're out of compliance with state code. So there are some things that states can do with making sure that there's equity, and then there's a whole host of things that cities need to do to catch up on that equity. And I live in a little majority white college town, and it's the same story where street food is still effectively banned. And then another thing that I mentioned is that we don't often think of historic preservation or the arts as being an urgent go-to thing during the time of protest, but it's all important, as we saw with the DC mayor riding Black Lives Matter down the street leading up to the White House. We need to literally make space for messaging right now, because this is a very contentious election with lives literally on the line.
I'd like to speak to your point about messaging. I think that is very pivotal. A lot of folks ask me, so are you saying you don't want, slow streets? And yes, because there hasn't been a public process, but no, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is how we name things, how we add policies, how we layer policies onto our interventions, how we program spaces is more important to me than what we do with the physical space, right? So it's not slow street, it's school streets, it's, safe routes for mutual aid. It's, give folks, designate space for people to maintain a sense of dignity and humanity, and then also be planning for those things in the long term.
Right, and I'll just weigh in that I'd like to echo both of those are great points. And I think one of the things that's been so clear to me in learning from colleagues and learning from practice at this challenging time is that it's not always appropriate for consultants to be the ones doing engagement. I think a really big investment that cities could think about, particularly in an era of diminished resources, is how staff is better connected and embedded with the communities that they serve. And that staff at the municipal level is, yes, being supported by other advocacy groups, by consultants, but primarily one of their key jobs is, or there's a positioning of resources for jobs that focus on the relationships, the trust, the communication, that creates a direct conversation over many, many years in a way that's very intentional and proactive. And I know very few communities where that is the case. It's oftentimes, okay, you guys have a great portfolio, you've got a track record of success, we like your team, it's a diverse team, that's great, but you come in from A, B, and C place, and then you work with us for a few months or a few weeks, and then you go off and do the other thing. So I think rethinking that whole system for me would make the work that I think that we do more successful. I think the connections and success for the local community would be better embedded and be the potential for transformation, so that when a consultant comes in, they're boosting the conversation that's already going on rather than inserting and trying to learn from in a quick few meetings or a Zoom call what to do next. And that's something that I think cities could really consider doing.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, and thanks for sharing it with our listeners today. I want to close with with this one last question around. We've talked a lot today about planning and processes and how there are intentional and unintentional impacts on the communities that then live around or live in those planned communities, or communities that have been planned. And so one of the questions I have is how can we help planners understand how to add a racial equity decision making, intentionality to how they plan communities, how they do planning, how they approach these things. And so are there some practical examples that you can share with us today around how are we engaging community in these processes so that their voices and that all of the impacts are considered as we engage in planning?
Well, I'll just briefly add, in a practical way, what we've started to think about and pivot towards in some of our planning work is to make sure, as an example, the work that we've done in Jersey City, which is, one of the most diverse cities in the US, oftentimes is debating whether it or Queens is more diverse, is to think about bike planning in that context, in that bike planning is not just about white stripes on the ground. It's about so many more other things and has impacts to so many other things that have to be taken into consideration. So the policies around that plan is kind of centered equity as a key piece about housing, about environmental justice, about the use of police force and how communities are policed, and that all these things kind of are swirling together and are connected, so that the policy response around equity has to be right there at the core to then think about, okay, how does that inform and impact the kinds of streets that we do wind up designing. So embedding that really in the center of a bike master plan, for example, 5 years ago, you probably would see nobody doing that. And I think now many, many people are trying to think about beyond the white stripes, what the impact would be for new infrastructure, whether it's cycling, walking, public space, outdoor dining, et cetera, and make sure there's an ecosystem that accounts for all of those impacts, both positive and negative.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas, Dr. Brinkley?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think that and I mentioned this in the presentation, I think what is apparent is that there are groups, community groups, there are direct service providers, there are advocates who are already doing the work of meeting communities where they are, and providing services that our local governments don't have the capacity to provide. And so I think these are people who are most familiar, not just with our streets, but with our streets right now, because we all get to benefit from being inside on Zoom. And so we need to go to them, go to the essential workers, go to the housing navigators, go to the behavioral health specialists that are still responding to mental health crises, and ask them to bring you along. on their journey, so that whatever you come up with is relevant to and within the context of resolving the suffering that so many people are experiencing. We can't plan in a vacuum anymore.
So true, so true. Dr. Brinkley?
I'll just say that through the database we've built, we've seen that something like environmental justice is done very, very, very differently in every different place. So you can't come up with a, this is going to work everywhere solution, because some cities like National City will focus on food swamps and fast food chains, and other cities will focus on bike lanes. It really depends on where that kernel has been built. I will say that I think if there's a group that you want to tap into that is pissed about what's happening right now and is really eager for change and is out there, it's the youth, because they're looking at what's happening right now and what their future is looking like, and they're not happy. So having constructive conversations about how to reshape the city to suit their needs, and then talking with educators and designing classroom components, those can often be really fun exercises for everybody, and kind of get the wheels spinning a little bit.
No, well, thank you guys so much. So we are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists today. This has just been such an amazing dynamic conversation. I have already been playing on the mapping tool and kind of started to just kind of play around and lost myself for a little while. But certainly all of the things that have been shared today have been really powerful, and certainly things that we all need to be thinking about as we move forward in this new reality or our new normal. I want to again thank our sponsors. Don't forget to mark your calendars for the next session of CPEX's Smart Growth Summit, Conscious Consumerism, Uplifting Black Businesses, featuring Maggie Anderson, author of Our Black Year, and Baton Rouge Mayor Sharon Weston Broome. Leading discussion of commercial exploitation of Black neighborhoods, equitable redevelopment of disinvested communities, and conscious consumerism. And that's going to be on October 6th. We hope to see you there. And again, thank you to our panelists who have been amazing today. We appreciate you taking the time to share with us your very thoughtful work and the ways in which we all need to consider how we want to have impacts on our communities. Thank you.